Welcome. I'm Brittany Utley, Program Director for Pier-Glass Poetry Panels, and today's panel explores poetry of the senses. We regret that Christopher Salerno will not be present today, as announced. In his place, Stan Galloway, our usual host, will step in. If you're joining us live, we ask you not to use the chat function, but instead send your questions and comments through the Q&A box at our site, pierglasspoetry.wixsite.com/my-site. We'll take a look at those towards the end of the show. But for now, to get us started, let's meet our first poet. The 2014 Commonwealth poet Phillippa Yaa de Villiers still can't quite believe it. A former actress who knew she'd have to write her own script, starting with Where the Children Live, runner-up, National Script Writing Prize, Original Skin, and the forthcoming Writing Out the Water. She has 3 poetry collections, including The Everyday Wife, which won the Sala Award 2011, edited No Serenity Here, an anthology of African poetry translated into Mandarin, as well as Change, a special edition of the Atlanta Review devoted to South African women poets, and contributed to the award-winning, groundbreaking Our Words, Our Worlds, writing on Black South African poets. She has performed and read her work on 3 continents, including as Commonwealth poet before the Queen of England. She teaches creative writing at Wits University. Welcome, Philippa.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm in Johannesburg. The sun's gone down. We've just heard the call to prayer, and there's noise, there's music, and there's all kinds of sounds around us. So this provocation of poetry of the senses was very challenging for me because I'm not one of those poets who really thinks about the senses. I'm more focused on telling a story, and trying to transmit a moment. So I'm going to start off by reading this poem, which came after a friend of mine was attacked in her house, and maybe we can talk about the senses that it evokes afterwards. So I'd also just like to say that I chose to make this poem into a prose poem because I think a prose poem creates a certain urgency, and it compresses the event somehow. It doesn't have the line breaks, it doesn't have the kind of lyrical pauses that you have with another kind of poem. So see what senses you find here. Don't mention the war. Foresee. Don't mention that your grandparents escaped gas ovens. Think of something nice to say. Anyway, it was long ago and you're still here almost. Don't mention the men in balaclavas who beat you and your husband in front of your 3-year-old child before locking you in the boot of your car. Crime brings down property values, so don't mention it. Don't mention Marikana and who gets what, and don't try to come up with a theory or make some claim about the relationship of crime to poverty. You've never been poor, so make do with your lot, and don't mention the robbers that crossed the double-stand adventure garden and forced themselves into the French windows of your 3-bedroomed farmhouse and dragged you out of your dream under the duck-down duvet. You pinched your lips together, stifled sounds as they manhandled you round the house, demanding money, and kicked away the teacher's salary in your wallet because it was not enough. Don't mention that you looted your child's money box for the $100 that her aunt in the US sent to her in increments of $10 per birthday and Christmas for the past 5 years. Don't mention them, especially to the child. She'll be furious. Don't mention that they tied you up and threatened to shoot you. There was no sign of a gun, and they were young and sounded foreign. And don't mention that after they left, you dragged yourself and the chair you were tied to the panic button and pressed it with your chin, and the security company took 40 minutes to come, and so you had ample time to think and mostly you thought, wonderful, I am alive. I'm hoping that you get a sense of what she was experiencing. So Marikana was a terrible event where over 40 people were killed by the police in South Africa. And so yeah, so I suppose it's about the sense of history, a sense of connection with political and social events that happen in your country. So it's not as embodied as the senses, as the 5 or the 6 senses would be. And this other poem is a little bit more, it's a little bit more intimate, I think. It's called Hiatus, and it goes like this. The first time I heard the word was after Daddy's double bypass. He has a hiatus hernia, the whispers of the big people. Daddy, my fortress, unbuilt by illness. Hiatus, Mommy explains, is a gap, a hole, an interruption in a continuum. His organs are squeezing through a small tear in his peritoneum. I, at 11, organ monkey, thoughts roll down the stairs he built, smelling of cobra floor polish, past the high window he built, light washing in. He sits on the bed he made in his new old flesh, smelling of hospital. I hear his wheeze of breath. He pulls my reluctant hand, repulsed, presses it to an orange-sized lump at the top of his white belly. That moment I knew I would live longer than he. So I guess for that one, the sense that came to me was the smells of the house, you know, the smell of the cobra floor polish, and then the light washing in, and I guess also the smell of hospital, you know. And when he came back from hospital, there was such a sense of his fragility, and the fragility of the whole house seemed to, it all just seemed so ready to fall apart. And so I guess that was what I was sort of hooking onto in the poem. But actually the poem came out of, the prompt was the word hiatus, which was given to us, and that sent me into that memory, which sent me to those senses, and the way the light came in through the window as a child, remembering that, and the wooden stairs, and my daddy. And yeah, the threats to his life, which just seemed really frightening to me, but a kind of a knowledge that I didn't have any control over, but just the knowledge itself was the triumph, in a way, that came out of the poem. I am not a person who writes poems. I write and poems emerge. I'm trying to work out who I am and what the memories weigh. So it's not like I go into a poem and think about what I'm going to write. I discover it, as I hope that you do too. So this one was a bit of a joke. So yeah, guillotine. Louis wouldn't kiss me when I gave him that blowjob. Said he couldn't do that to his wife. Kisses were only for the woman he loves, says Bella. That guy, who's Gloria, he gave me a STD. My thing was so sore I could hardly walk. He doesn't even know that she gave it to him. What? Yeah, she's doing Fernando. Louis's wife walks in at the door. Hello, ladies, the usual, please. Sure, madam, says Gloria. The basin is free. Would you like to take a seat? Bella, make the madam some tea. Louis's wife lies back on the sink, her neck all open, like she's on the guillotine. So it was just, I think the poem is more about um, silences and secrets, and so I think the image of the guillotine sort of captures the threat that no one is really talking about, and so I think I was trying to think of maybe I'm a poet of absences and silences because that is how I grew up. Um, and so I think that's what I put into poems, and that's what I leave them with. And I feel like sometimes the silences speak louder than the words, or the silences in conjunction with the words give another meaning.
Thank you for sharing all of those experiences and your perspective on all of those with us. You gave us a lot of individual senses that you pointed out in each one of your poems for us to look at. So thank you for sharing your 3 poems with us. Okay. Our second poet is a Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net nominee. Elaine Nadal is an author of 2 poetry chapbooks, When and Sweat, Dance, Sing, Cut, published by Finishing Line Press. Her work has appeared in several journals, including Beyond Words Literary Magazine, Haunted Waters Press, Hoot Review, Grassland, and Latino Book Review Magazine. We're happy to have you here, Elaine.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I will start with my first poem called Time. And before I start, I would like to tell you guys how it came about. So I was in New York at a book festival, and there was a workshop. And the workshop was about writing the blues. It was probably 30 minutes of, explaining the lecturer, instructor explained about the blues and then gave us 15 minutes to write one, and then we shared. Now, I take my time to write. Very rarely do I create something in 15 minutes. There have been a couple poems, but I couldn't create or finish this poem based in the blues in that allotted amount of time. So I did go home and waited a few days so I can finally put it together. Before I read it, the blues are an AAB pattern, so you're going to see some repetition. I repeat the first 2 lines, and then the third line sort of responds or gives more information to the previous lines. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is called Time. I gave the box of chocolates for days I couldn't eat a thing. I gave the box of chocolates for days I couldn't eat a thing. My little cousin isn't here, she took the flowers of spring. I was on a plane to Paris when she was on her bed dying. I was on a plane to Paris when she was on her bed dying. A soul can only take so much. It'd been 2 years of her crying. This wasn't the first time it happened. I couldn't hold grandmother's hand. This wasn't the first time it happened. I didn't hold grandmother's hand. I thought I had more time to give, shouldn't have played in the sand. I won't go on a trip anymore because I know what my lot brings. I won't go on a trip anymore because I know what my lot brings. I shouldn't go around flying. I don't deserve to have wings. This poem, Time, as I stated earlier, is in the AAB format. You can hear the repetition. There's also rhythm and melody, which appeals to sound, to hearing. And when I wrote this, I wanted to make sure that when I wrote this, I had something that was really meaningful, that really conveyed the melancholy of the blues, of that feeling. So this poem is actually very personal to me. It's about losing 2 very important people, one of them being my grandmother. She had been in the hospital for a couple months. She got sick in Connecticut, then got moved to a hospital in New York. And I grew up pretty much sheltered. For the first time, my father was like, "You can go to New York for a day or two and spend time with your aunts." And I was so excited. I was given a choice to see my grandmother at the hospital or to go to Manhattan and see the lights. And I was a teen. I went and saw the lights, and a couple of days later, received the news that my grandmother had passed away. So there was guilt with that. And then years later, my cousin got diagnosed with cancer. She battled cancer for 2 years, and I always travel in the summer. My dream was to go to Paris on my birthday. We were a family of not many means, and after I went to college and got a job, I said, you know what, travel is important. So I went to Paris, and right when I arrived at the airport and was able to access my messages, the message was that my cousin, who was in her early 20s, had passed away. So it was the second time that I lose two people after traveling or doing travel, and it really produced a lot of guilt in me. So that was time. My second poem is called Blue Bridge, and I will read it first and then talk a little bit about it. If you understood, you know that my song isn't about cherubs, cherry blossoms, or a charming prince. It's an empty rocking chair, a wind chime, a chromatic harmony, a holler, a wrinkled shadow, a distant heart, a familiar stranger with calluses on his feet, a wanderer eating rice with bare hands. Blue notes to wash the soil, blue notes to gather the soil, blue notes to part the sea. Crossing is hard, cross is heavy. Caterpillar can't swim, horse can't fly. Blue notes to wash the soil, blue notes to gather the soil, blue notes to part the sea. This poem is a short one, but one that's very meaningful to me as well. This poem, when it talking about sound and also the visual, I use a lot of imagery and also alliteration, the repetition of sounds. So cherubs, cherry blossoms, charming prince. Another one, another thing that I usually use is imagery. So I'll read this line again. Is an empty rocking chair, a wind chime, a chromatic harmony, a holler, a wrinkled shadow, a distant heart, a familiar stranger with calluses on his feet, a wanderer eating rice with bare hands. So the imagery of a familiar stranger with calluses on his feet, a wanderer eating rice with bare hands. And then I say, crossing is hard, cross is heavy, caterpillar can't swim, horse can't fly. This imagery creates this movement, this kind of rhythm. I titled it Blue Bridge. So in a sense, you get this idea of moving or heading somewhere, but also the imagery is one that you can see that there's also difficulty in moving, but at the same time, the importance of moving forward. That's being called the poem Blue Bridge. And my final poem is called A Dream. A Dream is one of the first poems that I wrote when I started writing again. I started writing again in 2013. So this poem is actually based on a dream that I really did have, but it's not exactly identical. So it is based on a dream that I did have. She was making rice and stirring a pot of pollo guisado, beautifully, meticulously, cariñosamente. I contemplated her. Smells good, right, mija? A plethora of flowers fell from the heavens, magenta, purple, blue, and silver. They descended gracefully, little, little lie, little, lie, carrying me to a fertile land. I saw Jibarito delighting in the freshly cut grass. With a melody on his lips and hierbas in his tattered hands, he scattered the seeds with care. Magia. Mommy continued mixing, a sprinkling of water on my head, warm, therapeutic, relajante. I closed my eyes, releasing a weariness, but my peace was interrupted. She stopped stirring, and I awoke to an empty stove. No pollo guisado, no flowers, no song. Now, in this particular poem, I use imagery as well, and I also use Spanish. to create with sound, to give more images, to also make it authentic to who I am. Now, that being said, not all the poems that I write are specifically about me, even if it's in first person, because many readers read a poem and they think first person is about the author, and that's not the case. This poem particularly is about a dream that I did have, so it does fit. And I included imagery and cultural references. El jibarito, is an important person from the country. He farms, he grows, he's self-sufficient, independent. And so I mentioned jibarito, I mentioned Lelo Lai, which is a musical phrasing that's very popular in Puerto Rico, and thus creates this sound. And with the imagery, with the sound, I hope that readers and listeners can kind of visualize this dream that I had. And there can be many interpretations as far as to what this dream means. This dream can be pessimistic if you see it that way, or it could be quite optimistic. The person, the narrative voice, woke up with no flowers, no rice, no song, but it could be also seen as an optimistic thing that could be the drive to push you forward to getting what you want. It is also nostalgic. So it can be interpreted in any way that you want. As the reader, as the listener, you put your own experiences to the pieces, because that's the beauty of poetry. Thank you so much for listening. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Elaine, for sharing your poems and not just how they use the senses, but all of your personal experiences that you have tied into those poems. It was really nice to hear. So I'll now move to our third and final poet for today. Stan Galloway is the founder of the Pier-Glass Poetry Panels and previously the founder of the Bridgewater International Poetry Festival. He is the author of 3 chapbooks and 1 full collection, Just Married, Unbound Content 2013. He has co-edited 6 poetry anthologies, including the forthcoming Savor, Poems for the Tongue, Friendly City Books 2022. His early works in Burroughs studies produced The Teenage Tarzan, McFarland 2010. Nominated for both the Pushcart and Best of the Net prizes, he has more than 200 poems published singly, online, and in print. He completed a joint residency with Nicole Yerkeba at Gutkistad Center for the Creative Arts at Lagervat, Iceland in 2020. Thank you for stepping in today.
Thank you, Brittany. I'm so happy to be here on the other side of the screen, so to speak. Thank you for agreeing to host us today. I appreciate you doing that. I want to talk a little bit about the senses in a very literal sense to begin with. We've been referring to the senses in terms of sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and I want to recognize that this is not a new thing. We have been looking at poetry, or poets have been looking through their senses for centuries. And so, for a beginning point, I want to go back to William Shakespeare and his sonnet number 130, and have us listen for the senses. He doesn't quite get them all, but you see most of them invoked in the course of this poem. Sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why, then her breasts are dun. If hair be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied, with false compare. So here we see, we hear, we smell. And there's even a hint of touch that comes into that poem. And for those who have studied Shakespeare's sonnets, you recognize that this is a bit of an outlier. Most of his poems do exactly what he says he's not going to do in this poem, and that is to make these grand comparisons, supersizing nature through the beloved. But this one he says, let me just be real for a minute. And I recognize that language has changed some over the years, but the line that always catches beginning readers of Shakespeare's work, I think, is that from my mistress reeks. Comparing her breath to perfume and saying, no, perfume is much better than anything coming out of her mouth. And so that line is one that I have carried with me for a number of years. And eventually, when I decided that I could write poetry too that was worth reading, my study of Shakespeare was something that grounded me, I guess. And so this is not a Shakespearean sonnet. It comes from my book, Just Married. But I think you'll recognize Shakespeare's influence. He's named in the second line, and the title is I Smell Onions. I smell onions on your breath, and think of Shakespeare's wire-haired mistress. You, too, submit to gravity and time. There's no mistaking your pretty human voice for birdsong. No wings or halo to confuse my dull mortal senses. For all the beauty of the nightingale's call and the sudden thrill of heavenly annunciation, I'd rather hear you, stepping through the doorway, say my name with plain, old, fallible, human affection. So in that poem, what we find is a number of senses that have been invoked, but certainly the beginning one of the smell. And there's a saying that I'm sure we've all heard, that seeing is believing. Mostly what we find in poetry is visual imagery, and there's nothing wrong with that. When we see something, or you may have heard someone say, I won't believe it until I see it with my own eyes. I don't think you've ever heard anyone say, I don't believe it until I've smelled it with my own nose. We rely very heavily on our sight. And so the idea of being heavily visually oriented in poetry is a natural consequence, I think, of our human makeup. Next to that, because poetry is also an audible form, sound is the second most invoked of the senses. And so in here, there's a comparison of her voice to birdsong. And we recognize that when we hear about sound, we're also hearing sound. And so we've got already a double layer on that element of poetry. We are hearing the poem as well as we are hearing about hearing in the poem. And that reinforces that sense. To get beyond that, though, to the smell, to the taste, and to the touch, often sets a poem apart. And so when you find a poem that does that, as the reference to the smell, both in this one and in Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, it moves us into a little different area within ourselves, within our own understanding, because unconsciously we try to engage those senses. And while we can't smell the reek of the mistress' breath or the onions in the second poem, we recognize and we may be sensitized to maybe what we're smelling at that point. The same happens with poems about taste or about touch. And finding a poem with all five senses addressed is rare. I don't have one. I looked, and I couldn't find one, and so I had to settle for hitting 3 out of 5. That's pretty good. Maybe 3.5. Depending on whether you consider some of what is wire haired a tactile image for you. For some people it might be. So if we stretch it, I got to 4. So being conscious about that may give you an additional tool in thinking, how do I develop this idea in the poem that I'm working on? Is there a way that I can address this by more than just what it looks like? And again, it depends on the purpose of the poem. It depends on what your aim is in the poem, but it also might depend on who you perceive your audience to be. You might also think about ways that that things that are normally expressed in a single sense might be expressed through multiple senses. Synesthesia, for example, which associates color with sound. Are there ways to cross up those senses? Is there a way to make us, to startle the reader perhaps, with an unexpected sense, rather than saying, about a landscape, I saw a great many mosses. You might say, I smelled a great many mosses, and suddenly it's a different poem. So thinking about the ways the senses work becomes an important element in the development of that poem. And as a poet, then we get to decide, what element do I want to include in it, and what maybe is better left unaddressed in that. So we've been talking about senses in a number of different definitions. Both Philippa and Elaine were talking about ways that we respond emotionally to a situation, and certainly that first poem by Philippa is one where we're being told, but not in words, about a horrendous event, and we're being told, but don't respond, don't react to it. And you if you were like me, you probably felt yourself getting a little nervous, a little tingly, wondering what's going to happen in this poem. I want to take us to another framework, though, and I get no kickback from this, but I want to talk just for a few moments about a book. It's about 30 years old now, by Gary Chapman, called The 5 Love Languages. Some of you may know about it. Some of you may have heard about it, not as a part of that book, but through other, lectures or situations that you've been in. But psychologically, Chapman suggests that there are, in addition to the 5 senses that we experience the world with, there are also 5 senses by which we understand love. And just as a recap of those, the first is physical touch and closeness, gift giving, acts of service, quality time, and words of affirmation. And his theory is that just as sight is the one sense that most people rely on for understanding the world around them, so from these 5 senses, each of us has a dominant sense. For some of us, the ultimate act of love is in giving to somebody. The problem becomes, unlike the human condition, where sight is pretty well dominant for most people, with the love languages, it's not true. They're spread out across that continuum. And so I wanted to use these 5 love senses in a poem, and did so in one of the first poems that I had published, and you can find it in Scratching Against the Fabric, the first anthology that I edited. And so it's couched in terms of childhood. But I want you to listen for those 5 senses to see how each of them gets incorporated into this budding romance. Budding might be even the wrong word. The title of the poem is Failed Romance. The little boy offers his best fire truck and invites her to the box, while she sees the castles he has not built and the prince who has not ridden to the rescue. He says he likes the way she shows the ribbon in her hair, meaning he likes the way she shows the ribbon in her hair, while she hears the 1/10th surface to a 9/10 depth he won't reveal. He reaches out to tie the shoestring that falls loose, and she begins to list the 100 other broken things he's failed to see, thinking love and entropy are opposites. He drives his cars around her, happy that she chose to squat with him for a time, and she wonders why he needs her there while he does his own thing, oblivious. Then she begins to talk, and he turns his ear to her and finally says again he likes the ribbon. And she turns away and leaves the box to the shallow boy with the one-track mind. So in that you can see the various miscues, the attempts that he is making in his words of affirmation, in his acts of service, in his gift giving, in spending time with her, and then finally in just listening to her. And she doesn't connect. She doesn't understand the language that he's speaking. And I think that that's a situation that many of us find ourselves in, where we're speaking something in a poem and we recognize that the listener is not understanding what we're saying. As a poet, that's something we have to work at. And so here's a poem, that exhausts the five languages that are there. I truly appreciated Elaine including the Spanish in her poem, because it reminds us that there is more than one language that we speak. Most Americans speak only one language, but many other cultures are multilingual. And we recognize that some things are easier said in one language than another. And finding the right word, finding the right phrase, finding the right cadence even, is something that we have to sense. And in this case, I'm not talking about the physical sense of touching, but intuition, perhaps that sixth sense that Philippa alluded to when she started. We have this sixth sense, this intuition of what seems right and what seems wrong, whether we can explain why or not. And poets use that a lot when they're working with sound, with meaning, with diction, with patterns, with breaking patterns, with line length. All of those things are often intuitive for the poet that becomes more comfortable the more the poet writes. And we may not think of those as senses until we can nail down, oh, I like the sound of those words together as opposed to a different one. So let me wrap up there and say thank you for having me and for letting me fill in for Christopher today. And hopefully we'll have some more thoughts about the way the senses work for a poet, which may or may not be different, than anybody else. But I'll hand it back to you, Brittany.
Thank you. I thought it was fitting that you started with a Shakespeare sonnet and then you ended on a love poem. So I thought, I don't know if you planned it that way intentionally, but I thought that was a nice way to circle back to Shakespeare in a weird way. But I want to remind everybody, as always, if you want to send in questions, to go ahead over to the website and send those in, and I'll check in with Morgan in a little bit to see if we've got any. But for now, I actually wanted to go back to something that you just mentioned with your last poem, Failed Romance. And you had mentioned that sight is usually something that a lot of poets tend to use in their poems, but I wasn't sure if there was something that you or Elaine or Philippa, if there was one sense, whether it was sight or if it was another one that you guys found yourselves using the most when it came to drafting your poetry.
Particularly for me, I use sound. I read my poems over and over again, and I think of it as musical measures. So for me, sound is very, very important when you say the poem and when you read the poem, the cadence. So that's the first thing.
Yeah, for me, sound is also very important. Wait, let me just put my camera on, sorry. Sound is also important. I also read my poems aloud. And I think, thank you for inviting me, because I learned something that I wasn't aware of as a poet in terms of developing an element in the poem. I'd never thought about finding the words to talk about that, because I think that moment of when my father when the father presses the speaker's hand to the hernia, that orange sized lumpish piece of flesh, it's that tactile sense, and I think that's also what I try to bring across. Also sound, but also like I want them to feel where I am, what it's like.
Yeah, I think as both Elaine and Philippa have said, sound is crucial for a poet, and I think that poets may be more attuned to sound than the general readership is. But I will admit that my first drafts are pretty much visual. I talk about what I see, and it's only when I go back to revise that I have to question myself on whether the visual is the best entry into the idea that I'm trying to work with. And so most of the time when I have incorporation of other senses, it has been purposeful. It wasn't the first thing I thought of, but it became the best route for me to develop the poem with.
That's interesting, because I was wondering how, when you're making your first draft, if sound was something that you guys were thinking of as you were making that first draft, or if it was something that came up as you were editing or revising, or if sight, as you just said, was kind of the focal point for you as a visual when you're first making that draft, or if I don't know, if you kind of start with your mind already, I want to include these senses as like a prompt, or if it's something that kind of comes as you're making changes and edits to those poems.
think the drafting happens. I think that the consideration of sound happens more unconsciously for me in the first draft. It's not that I don't pay attention to it because having worked with poetry long enough, it kind of it's kind of like driving a car. You don't really pay attention to how you do it. You just you go about doing it. And sound is one of those things. It's the gear shift, or it's the gas pedal or whatever. You don't get anywhere without the sound in a poem. But I am much more conscious of sound after the first draft because then I know, oh, I've got a poem, and I've got to think about how do I make this poem shine, a visual image. How do I make this poem sound right? How do I make it to go through other senses? How do I make this poem smell right? To a reader or a listener. So for me, sound is always there, but it's more consciously there after the first draft, which I think may differ from what I'm hearing from some of the others.
I think it also depends on the poem, I mean, that first poem, Don't Mention the War, when I think about it now, I'm thinking that what I really wanted to honor was her courage,
Mm-hmm.
and in the face of all those things that were pressing down on her, what she ended with, wonderful, I'm alive. And for me, poetry is about life, it is life.
I agree with Philippa. It does depend on the poem. In my case, most of my poems sound is at the forefront from the beginning, because I just hear it like music, So, but yeah, it does depend on the poem. There's some poems where I just go straight to the story, but for the most part, when I'm writing, sound is from the first draft.
Mm.
I just want to say about Don't Mention the War. What an amazing accomplishment that poem is. It reminds me of Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, where the words just come flowing one after another right on top of each other with no time to really process what's going on. And I think that's part of this experience that you're trying to get across in here is that sense of overwhelming in that moment. And I do love that ending where you say, "Oh, but that's not the end. The end is I'm still alive." And I think that breath that we get through that final line, I think, is crucial for that poem.
But now I'm thinking, imagine if I'd thought about the smell of sweat or, like I'm thinking, there's so many ways that it could have been better, man. But it's too late. It's done.
The next one.
Yeah.
I was curious, Philippa, if you wanted to talk more about what being a Commonwealth poet was like or is like, and what all of that involves for you when you're writing.
Well, sorry, I've just realized that my power's not in. I think that it's got very little to do with anything that's important to me. I'm always encouraged to mention it because it's a milestone, it's an achievement. But these things are actually, they just get in the way for because you want to listen to the music and you want to but you have to. I mean, Elaine, Miss Pushcart nominee, like how how does it affect? Do you feel like the next time you start writing a poem, okay, I am a pushcart nominee. I am writing as a pushcart. I am writing as a commonwealth. No. Actually, you just want to be with your poem and try and hear what it's trying to tell you. But yeah, it was a weird thing because on the flight going over, it was the first time something like that had ever happened to me, right? And I just felt I had that feeling like, you know, when you've had sex for the first time and you feel like it's written all over your face, and you're going to go home and your mother is going to say, you've done this thing. And, you know, you actually nobody knows. It's just you and that person, and only you know. And I was on the plane, and I was sitting next to this man, and he said to me, "Oh, well, why are you traveling to England?" And I said, "I'm the Commonwealth poet." And he says, "Oh, what's your name?" And I said, "Phillippa Yaa de Villiers." And he said, "Never heard of you." And that's basically what it means to me. Yeah.
I love the humility of that response, Philippa, and thank you for being a real person rather than just a title for us.
Thank you for the question, Brittany.
Of course. I guess I'll check with Morgan, I guess, to see if we've gotten any questions from anybody yet.
Yeah, we have one right now. It says, Philippa mentioned not thinking about a poem at first, and instead the poem emerging. Do the panelists find that it is sometimes similar when it comes to which senses are included in a poem, that they end up emerging and you discover which ones to include as you write?
Yes, I think absolutely. That is the case. We've talked about organic form, letting the poem suggest what shape it takes, and I think that's true of the incorporation of the senses too. You let the poem kind of suggest, as Philippa said, the sweat didn't emerge, it didn't suggest itself when she was writing that poem. Maybe because she didn't ask. What are the smells of this situation? But likely, as a poet, as we're grappling, typically we don't have 64 questions that we're doing a checklist on to say how is this poem going to develop. It is more organic, and if there was a smell present, if it was important, it might emerge without me having to ask. What was the smell of that barn that day or whatever. So I think the intuition in that question that there's something organic about the incorporation of the senses as well as the form of a poem is on target.
Well, I mean, just also in terms of, the sense of loss, and it's you do it in such a throwaway kind of way, Stan, in your poem about the failed romance, and just I think sometimes, and I think you also do that so well, Elaine, because you say what is there. And I think poems sometimes, as poets, we sometimes overwork what it's supposed to mean, but that very close observation of the hospital bed, the two children playing, the little boy who's just not, who's not getting across. For me, it's those silences that speak volumes about the meat of the poem, the matter of the poem, and they really, really matter.
Does anyone else, any of the other panelists, have any other thoughts or questions that they had for one another or things they wanted to talk about.
I'm very happy with the conversation that we've had, and I think that coming at this idea of the senses from both a literal and a more general or metaphoric sense has been helpful for me to think about when I'm writing, how conscious am I of what I'm doing? Because after several years of doing something, you, like I said, kind of like driving a car, you don't pay attention. And sometimes, I mean, not that we're going to get in a car wreck, if we don't drive our poem the right way, but I think that we start to follow the same routes. We don't, we know where the stop signs are, we know where the turns are, and I wonder if something like this might be a little wake up to say, if you keep paying attention, you might get something more than what you've been doing.
Mm. Mm. And I think also, like when Elaine talks about paying attention to guilt, to the guilt that she felt. And sometimes that's not something that we want to look at. We want to talk about something else. But like I found that very moving and brave.
Thank you.
Right. Well, if no one has anything else that they would like to add or ask, then I can start to wrap up. Morgan, did anything else happen to come in? Okay.
Yes. It says, the panelists allude to poetry as a means of processing the world around us and who we are. Would anyone like to expand upon this and use poetry in this way?
I'm not quite sure I understand the second part of that question, but to go back to the first part, I think that when I write a poem, when the urge to write a poem, when the urge to write, period, whether it's a poem or not, comes on me, it's because I feel like there is something inside me that is not connecting to something outside me. Or rather, there is something that is connecting, and I haven't been able to understand how it's connecting. And so this is a way of processing the internal and the exterior, I think, which I think is what that question is asking there at the beginning. And that can be a very personal thing. Why do I cry when I smell sour milk? I don't know. That's a very individualized thing. Or it might be, why do I get angry when I see injustice on television? Or it might be, it has been raining for 8 days straight now, and I'm feeling all cooped up. How do I cope with this? I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we engage the world around us, and every one of those might become a poem. So I think it's that urge to, I don't like the word codify, but to establish a plausible, not necessarily definitive, but a plausible connection between what I'm thinking and feeling with what the world that I see around me. Does that make sense?
Morgan, can you repeat the question if you don't mind, please?
Yeah. The panelists allude to poetry as a means of processing the world around us and who we are. Would anyone like to expand upon this and using poetry in this way?
I think from my experience, ever since I was a teen writing poetry, first and foremost, it was therapy for me. I needed to do it. So, and I stopped writing for some time and I came back to it. It was calling me, it was drawing me. So first thing for me is a need. I have to write. I need to write. I need to create poetry. And I certainly think it's the way, yes, what I observe in the world, also presenting different truths, uncomfortable truths. I find that many times uh, the most I, the most difficult poems to write are the ones that need to be written. I recall one poem specifically that I wrote, Colony, and I was terrified of writing that poem. And I kind of like held up, but I kept hearing that line every day. I'm like, oh my goodness, but how am I going to, get this poem going? What's going to come off of this poem? And I just wrote that line that I keep hearing in my head. And it was so therapeutic, so cathartic for me. And it's also discovery. I think that when you write poetry, you discover different truths, but you also discover maybe things that you don't know about yourself. It does give you a form of strength. I still can remember writing that poem, and it took some time. It was really uncomfortable for me, and I realized, okay, this is based on my experiences and my observations. And one thing that I always say, as when you write poetry, when you are a writer in general, you are observing, and you're reading, because reading is important, and you continue to learn and grow. So yes, I think it's how we see the world, but also what we see around and what others say, because a lot of times poems can be someone else's truth, and I think that's just the beauty of poetry.
Mm. Yeah, for me, that we have to, like, for me, bringing experience into language has made it possible to live, because sometimes the experience is just this amorphous thing that's very overwhelming, the emotion, but if I can form it into something that I can share, and in the sharing, it becomes something else. It's no longer mine, it's ours. And for me, poetry is a fire that invites people to sit and grow warm and actually see themselves and have their own memories, come up.
I love what you're saying, Philippa, about the voice, because whether the poetry is about the poet or not, it is very real, and it is a story, and yes, it is codifying, it is sharing the stories of the people, and it is surviving, and I know a writer, one of my favorite writers, I think it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, said that fiction is more real sometimes than even real, life itself. So just to just think about that, you're breathing into the poem, and you're telling stories. It's just the voice, the importance of the voice, and also discovering your own voice when you write, and continue to rediscover, because we want to continue growing and learning. So that's beautiful that you said that.
I think it's also important that the word discovery that you used, Elaine, and was implicit, I think, in what Philippa was saying, is something that I overlooked when I was talking earlier. Sometimes you don't know how you connect with the world around you, and it's only through writing and trying out different things you say, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. Oh, maybe part of that is right. So there is that element of discovery that is in poetry that the reader never gets to see. That's the poet's process of discovery. That the reader only gets the discovery, not the process of discovery, unless the poem is able to capture that journey that the poet goes on.
But even still, it's very much their journey, and it's completed by the people that receive the poem. So poetry is always open-ended. It's a conversation.
It relies on a reader in the end. But if no one ever reads it, and I write a poem, I've still written a poem, That's not that's. I do generally intend what I write to be read by others. We talked a little bit about journaling yesterday. Sometimes, though, that pre-writing or that writing that we do that leads into a poem, we keep for ourselves. And there's value on both parts of that. As poets, and in the panel today, our conversation has been about the part that goes public. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a part of poetry writing that doesn't go public.
But also, Stan, I mean, you're the same person that you were before you wrote that poem. You know, I feel like there's something about that poem that alters your DNA, that you know something now that you didn't know before. You stand version 2.5, you know, like every time. And that's the thing, poets are constantly reinventing themselves.
I agree with you exactly. I'm not the same person that I was yesterday because of the things that have happened in between. And while on a large scale, those are microdecimals that have changed in me over time. Yeah, I don't know if either of you have looked back at some of your early work that's been published and you go, oh, I would never write that now. But yeah, it happens. I go, no, I wouldn't have done that. Yeah, we do change. Our sensibilities change. Our priorities change. Our techniques change. Now again to go back to don't mention the war. If you were to write it now after today's conversation, we might find some sweat in that poem. Just because your lenses have been readjusted, kind of like you've been to the optometrist and said, now how do you see the world?
Yeah.
I think that we go through that optometrist check, many times a day.
But especially we go through that optometrist check in conversations with other poets. Like this conversation is subtly making some changes in the way I see things and the way I'm going to approach the text the next time, And I think that's so even when you're a student or you're in an amateur poetry group or whatever, you're always working on your voice.
I'm so happy to have you say that, Philippa. That's part of the purpose of doing these panels, is to sharpen ourselves, to sharpen those who listen, and to think about, okay, how might I do this differently? The more tools you have, the better chance you have of doing a good job. And each of these panels that we present is another tool that we can use, not in a blatant, callous way, but in the sense that maybe tools is the wrong word, maybe skills. These are things that we can now bring to bear to make us better at what we do, which is writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's something that it took me a while to understand. Not that I'm a seasoned poetry veteran by any means, but I think even when I would take poetry classes and things like that, and I would be in there with people probably just like this class, with people that had never written a poem or thought that they would ever write a poem, and they kind of are forced to start writing poetry, and they say, oh, well, maybe this is something that can actually help me cope with this thing or express this thing or come in contact with something that they hadn't previously thought about, or something that they can keep learning from. And so that is something that I've definitely noticed with people around me and with myself with writing things. Morgan, there's not anything else, right? I don't think so. Okay. Does anybody have any other final thoughts or things that they would like to share? If not, I'll wrap up. Okay. Well, I want to offer one final thank you to our three panelists, Philippa, Elaine, and Stan, for joining us today. You've all offered some really brilliant observations on how to include and incorporate the senses into poetry and to do so meaningfully. So thank you to you guys and to all of those who have tuned in today. Take care, everybody.